So if you wanted to figure out exactly why a multi-billion-dollar banking system suddenly collapses overnight, right? Or why a seemingly invincible global superpower just fractures into pieces.
Right, you definitely wouldn't start by looking in an engineering textbook.
No, exactly. And you certainly wouldn't expect the answer to involve, of all things, a fly.
A fly, yeah. I mean, specifically a 1,400-year-old description of a single annoying housefly.
Which sounds like a setup for a surrealist joke,
Oh,
honest.
totally. It
I
really
mean,
does. But in reality, it is actually perhaps the most precise diagnostic metric for civilizational failure that we have on record.
it's wild. Because, think about the systems you interact with every single day. The financial institutions that hold your labor,
Yeah.
the political hierarchies dictating local laws, the algorithmic platforms filtering your reality.
Yeah.
We tend to view these structures as monolithic, untouchable.
Yeah, we assume that because they're massive, they must be structurally sound.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But today, in this deep dive, we are going to subject those exact systems to a very specific, totally unforgiving audit.
Yes, we are.
We are opening up a text that a vast majority of the global population categorizes purely as religious poetry.
Right, Surah Al-Hajj, specifically Ayat 72 through 74.
Right. But we are going to do something radically different with it today.
We are stripping away the theological sentimentality entirely, and this is a really crucial framing for you listening right now.
Absolutely.
We are not here to discuss personal spirituality or, rituals of devotion. We are reading this text as a masterclass in sociology, behavioral economics, and systems engineering.
No sermons.
Yeah.
Structural mechanics.
I love that. Yeah.
Because when you read these specific verses through the lens of human valuation and power dynamics,
Yeah.
they stop sounding like ancient mystique.
They really do. They start sounding like a highly classified post-mortem report on a failed society.
Yeah. These verses detail the exact mechanics of how societies rot from the inside out when they invest their collective belief into completely impotent structures.
And, crucially, the violent psychological reactions that occur when someone dares to point out that the math doesn't add up.
The stakes we are talking about here are systemic survival.
Right. The text posits a rigid hypothesis, essentially. Any society that misappraises where actual power lies is mathematically guaranteed to collapse.
It's not a divine curse, it's a mechanical inevitability.
Exactly. It's a structural guarantee.
So I want to jump straight into the deep end here because the text sets its traps so brilliantly.
It really doesn't ease you into a philosophical debate.
No. It opens with an empirical demolition of false power that is almost offensive in how trivial it is.
Yes, let's look at that. The parable in Ayat 22.73.
Right, so it translates to, well, roughly, those you call upon besides God could never create a fly, even if they all gathered for it, and if the fly snatched something from them, they could not retrieve it.
Notice how that completely bypasses every single metric human beings normally use to measure authority.
It totally ignores them.
If an institution wants to convince you of its sovereignty, what is its default strategy? It relies on scale.
Right, it points to its standing army, its nuclear arsenal, its gold reserves.
Exactly. It's centuries of codified law or, the sheer volume of its digital user base today. It relies on the architecture of intimidation.
And the human brain is completely wired to fall for it.
Oh, absolutely.
Like if I stand in front of a massive skyscraper owned by a huge hedge fund, my biological instinct is to feel small. I assume the entity that built it possesses ultimate power.
But this text steps right past the marble columns and the balance sheets and demands a completely different functional test.
It demands the generation of biological reality from scratch.
It is the ultimate systems test. The text argues that the definitive metric of any claimed authority is not what it can accumulate or what it can destroy, but what it can demonstrably produce. It subjects the institutions and ideologies that society reveres to the smallest possible creative act.
Okay, I have to play devil's advocate here, though, because I can hear a modern listener objecting right now.
Go for it.
Isn't demanding the creation of a fly from nothing an entirely rigged metric?
Right, it feels impossible.
It feels like an impossible standard that deliberately ignores massive human progress. I mean, modern medicine cures diseases. Silicon Valley builds artificial intelligence. We split the atom.
We do create incredible things.
We do.
Yeah.
So why does this text demand the biological creation of a fly as the absolute only valid metric of power? Isn't that just a rhetorical trick to, I don't know, Dismiss human achievement?
That is exactly the pushback a rational systems auditor should have, but it misses the distinction the text is making.
Okay, what distinction?
The distinction between intrinsic power and derivative power. Everything you just listed, medicine, AI, nuclear physics, all of that is derivative.
Meaning what, exactly?
Meaning, human beings are incredibly skilled at rearranging atoms that we did not bring into existence.
Right.
We are utilizing laws of physics that we did not author. We synthesize, we manipulate, we extract, but we do not originate.
Ah. We are mechanics, not the inventor of the combustion engine.
Precisely. We are the ultimate middle managers of the material universe.
Wow.
And look, there is nothing inherently wrong with that. Our survival depends on that manipulation.
Yeah.
The structural vulnerability is introduced when a society begins to worship the middle managers as if they were the CEO.
Okay, that makes so much sense.
When we attribute unquestionable sovereignty to entities that only possess derivative power, we introduce a catastrophic flaw into the societal code.
So the test of the fly is not meant to deny human ingenuity at all.
Not at all. It is meant to surgically strip away the illusion of human sovereignty.
The source material illustrates this with this phenomenal analogy that really grounds this in the modern world.
The Davos analogy.
Yes. Imagine the most powerful human beings on the planet, right?
Yeah.
The trillionaires, the heads of state, the commanders of the largest militaries, tech founders.
They decide to form a grand global coalition, what the source refers to as a limited concern.
Right, so they pool the entirety of human wealth, intellectual capital, and technological hardware. And they were all sitting around this magnificent table in Davos or Geneva, drinking tea, strategizing the fate of the global economy.
It's a concentration of ultimate human authority in one single room.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And while they are debating global supply chains, a single ordinary housefly buzzes into the room.
Right.
It lands on the rim of a teacup belonging to the most powerful person there. It extends its little proboscis, snatches a microscopic grain of sugar, and just flies up to the ceiling.
The scenario is so deliberately insulting.
Completely insulting. Because at that exact moment, you realize the absolute impotence of that room. All the armies, all the algorithmic high-frequency trading platforms.
Hypersonic missiles.
Yes. None of it can retrieve that specific grain of sugar. Once the fly has ingested and metabolized it,
It's gone.
it's gone. And even more devastatingly, with all their combined resources, that room full of supposed masters of the universe cannot manufacture that fly.
They can't.
They cannot generate the self-sustaining, reproducing, biological reality of that trivial, annoying insect.
And by choosing the fly, the text eliminates the excuse of scale.
What do you mean?
Well, if the challenge were to create a star or a tectonic plate, the global elite could mask their failure. They could just argue, well, we understand the physics, it's just an issue of energy output, we just don't have the fuel.
Right, they could blame a lack of resources.
Exactly. But a fly requires almost zero material mass. The failure to produce it proves that the issue isn't a lack of resources, it is a fundamental absence of intrinsic creative capability. It reveals that human power is terrifyingly fragile. I mean, you cannot even secure your own teacup against the lowest form of life, yet you demand that millions of citizens submit to your economic and legal frameworks without question.
It just completely hollows out the aura of invincibility. It deflates it instantly.
It really does.
But, if we accept that the object of our reverence, whether it's a political system, a charismatic leader, whatever, is functionally powerless at this fundamental level, it forces a deeply uncomfortable mirror back onto us.
Absolutely.
What does it say about a society that willingly bows down to a system that completely fails the fly test?
That is exactly where the text transitions from a critique of authority to a diagnosis of societal psychology.
Right, the linguistic part.
Yes. The parable concludes with this fascinating phrase, weak are the seeker and the sought. The Arabic term used there is daif. Daif, denoting profound weakness, fragility, or structural impotence.
Let's break down those two roles, because this is key. In a sociological context, who is the seeker and who is the sought?
Okay, so the sought is the false object of reverence, the institution, the ideology, the economic paradigm, the ruling elite.
The thing on the pedestal.
Exactly. It is whatever entity is claiming authority and demanding submission. The seeker, on the other hand, is the worshiper.
The citizen.
The citizen, the voter, the consumer, the laborer. The person who actively invests their belief, their energy, and their resources into that false object.
So it's not just a tyrant oppressing a helpless victim in a vacuum. It's a transaction. It's a symbiotic loop of failure.
It is entirely symbiotic. A false institution does not have intrinsic power, right? The fly test proved that. It cannot sustain itself.
Okay, so how does it survive?
The only way a false system survives is by harvesting the actual, tangible energy of the seeker. The power of the sought is purely an illusion granted by the psychological submission of the masses.
Wow, so it literally takes two to make a false system work. You need a centralized power willing to pretend it has authority.
And you need a decentralized mass of people willing to suspend their critical thinking and hand over their agency.
I want to build out an economic analogy here to really make the mechanics of Da'if clear for everyone listening.
Let's do it.
Let's look at the architecture of a collapsing financial system. Let's say you have a massive central banking authority. It dictates the value of currency, controls inflation, determines who gets loans and who goes bankrupt.
The whole 9 yards.
Right. The entire civilization assumes this bank is an indestructible fortress. But let's say behind the heavy steel vault doors, there is absolutely nothing.
A purely fiat illusion, backed by zero tangible assets.
Exactly. No gold, no productive capacity, just dust. Now, according to the text, the sought is weak. It is dafi.
Because it is fundamentally impotent. It holds nothing of intrinsic value.
Right. But what about the citizen? What about the depositor who is working 80 hours a week in a factory, completely ruining their physical health, just to earn the paper notes printed by that empty bank?
The text argues the citizen is equally dahiv. Their weakness is profound because their entire reality, their security, their retirement, their social standing is tethered to a collective hallucination.
They are literally bleeding their real biological labor into a vacuum.
Yes. The weakness infects both ends of the transaction. It's impotence, compounding impotence.
But here is the question that always bothers me when we talk about systemic collapse.
Okay, what is it?
If the vault is empty, if the system is genuinely that weak and incapable of producing real equity, why doesn't the citizen just walk away? Seriously, if I know the bank is running a scam, I withdraw my labor and I leave. Why do millions of people stay and prop up structures that fail the fly test?
Because you are assuming human beings always act as perfectly rational economic agents, and they just don't.
Right. We're messy.
Very messy. The false system survives on the exploitation of psychological sunk costs.
Explain that.
If a citizen has spent 40 years of their life and the entirety of their identity serving an empty vault, walking away requires an agonizing admission. It requires acknowledging that they have wasted their life. It requires admitting that they were fooled. Most people will fight violently to defend the empty vault simply to protect their own ego from that realization.
Because the cognitive dissonance is just too painful. It's easier to pretend the paper money has value than to admit you are completely destitute.
Exactly. Furthermore, the ruling class knows exactly how to manipulate that fear. They provide a comforting narrative. They offer simplistic answers to complex problems.
And in exchange, they demand your autonomy.
Yes. The seeker needs the sought to provide an illusion of safety in a chaotic world, and the sought needs the seeker to provide the actual physical labor required to keep the lights on.
It is a structural codependency built on a shared lie.
And the text is warning us. A civilization built on compounding impotence cannot survive the friction of reality. It is destined to fracture.
Which brings us to the defense mechanisms. Because an empty vault doesn't just sit there peacefully, right? It actively defends itself.
It has to.
If a system knows it is fundamentally weak, it has to build walls around the truth. And the source material we are working from makes a massive foundational distinction here regarding how vested interests protect themselves.
Yes, this is a crucial point.
It differentiates between a personal religion, which false powers are perfectly happy to tolerate, and a comprehensive socioeconomic system of equity, which the source identifies by the Arabic word deen.
This distinction is literally the engine of the entire historical conflict. But first, we need to clearly identify the vested interests.
Right. Who are we talking about?
The source points to a recurring historical triad that controls society. You have the capitalists who hoard the wealth,
The money.
then the political or monarchical class that controls the monopoly on violence, and finally, the theocratic or narrative class.
The priests, the media, the spin doctors.
Exactly, the ones who control the psychological framing. This triad thrives exclusively on the exploitation of the seekers.
The 90% working to enrich the 10%.
Yes. Now, how does that 10% maintain control? The source uses a brilliant historical case study here. The British Empire in India.
Right.
When the British East India Company, and later the Crown, colonize the subcontinent, they did not arrive and demand that everyone abandon their personal beliefs. In fact, they did the exact opposite.
They issued royal proclamations explicitly granting religious freedom,
Right.
which on a surface level sounds incredibly enlightened. If you read that in a high school history book, you think, wow, what a tolerant, pluralistic empire,
But you have to audit the motivation. Why did they do it?
right?
The empire understood a fundamental sociological mechanism. Personal rituals do not threaten the supply chain.
Oh.
A personal religion, the way you pray in your living room, the specific dietary laws you follow, the hymns you sing, none of that challenges the hierarchy of power.
That is so true.
The British authorities were perfectly content to let Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, and Christians practice their respective rituals because none of those rituals audited the vault.
Explain the mechanical difference to me here. Why does a capitalist supply chain care if I call my belief system a religion or a deen?
Because a religion, in this specific exploitative context, is localized and private. It is about your personal salvation in the afterlife.
Okay.
And if your entire focus is on securing a good spot in heaven, you are much less likely to demand fair wages on earth.
Man.
A deen, however, is a comprehensive system of living. It dictates economics, jurisprudence, social welfare, and the distribution of power.
So the East India Company is essentially saying, hey, we don't care if you bow to the east or the west. We don't care what idols you have in your temple.
Go ahead and fast. Go ahead and check.
Just make sure you pay your land tax. Make sure you export your raw cotton to Manchester at a fraction of its intrinsic value.
And make sure you recognize the British Governor General as the ultimate sovereign authority in the public square.
Exactly. The exploitative system doesn't just tolerate harmless rituals, it actively funds and encourages them. It acts as an opiate.
It is a pressure release valve. The triad of vested interests will happily watch a population argue for decades over minor theological differences.
Right, like how many times to wash your hands before a prayer, or what specific clothes are holy.
Yes. Because while the population is distracted by those micro-debates, the triad is quietly extracting all the mineral wealth and labor from the country.
It's literally, please, go argue about dietary laws so you don't look at the shipping logs.
Precisely. Historically, empires have never cared about the proliferation of idols or personal spiritualities as long as the status quo of economic dominance is maintained.
Right.
But the text we are analyzing, this Quranic message, was not introduced to the world as a personal religion. It was not a request to add one more idol to the pantheon or one more private ritual to your weekend.
Right.
It was introduced as a deen, a revolutionary empirical system designed to permanently dismantle human exploitation.
It audited the vault.
It kicked the doors of the vault wide open. The foundational premise of this deen was that absolute sovereignty belongs solely to the immutable laws of reality, which it attributes to God.
And the immediate, terrifying sociological implication of that premise is that no human being, no king, no CEO, no priest, has the inherent right to rule over another human being arbitrarily.
It demanded economic equity, it demanded the dismantling of tribal and racial hierarchies, it demanded the redistribution of hoarded wealth so that capital didn't just circulate among the rich.
And the moment you introduce that kind of empirical demand into a system built on compounding impotence, the empire strikes back.
Of course.
Because that is no longer a debate over theology.
Right.
That is an existential threat to the monopoly on power.
Which brings us perfectly to the next diagnostic metric, in Ayat 22.72. We move from analyzing the system to analyzing the psychological reaction of the people running the system when they are confronted with the truth.
Yes, let's read that. The verse reads, "When our clear verses are recited to them, you recognize denial on the faces of the deniers. They almost assault those who recite them."
The Arabic word used for that denial is munkar.
Munkar.
Yeah.
I want to focus heavily on this because it is one of the most astute behavioral observations I've ever encountered.
It's incredibly precise.
The verse doesn't say they disagree with the argument. It says you recognize denial on their faces. It's physiological.
Right.
When a vested interest is presented with clear empirical disconfirming evidence that proves their authority is hollow, their reaction is never a calm, rational counter-argument.
They never pull out a whiteboard and say, hey, let's review your data.
Never. They exhibit visceral, uncontrolled hostility.
Munkar isn't just a polite refusal. It is a deep-seated, aggressive rejection of something that threatens the core of one's identity.
The face betrays what the argument cannot defend.
Exactly. The people running the empty vault know, on a subconscious level, that they cannot pass the fly test. So when an auditor points out the failure, The immediate impulse is not to refute the messenger's data. It is to physically or socially destroy the messenger. They almost assault those who recite them.
It's the impulse to smash the mirror because you are horrified by the reflection.
Oh, yes.
Let's modernize this because this happens in boardrooms and government offices every single day. Let's look at a massive algorithmic fraud. Imagine a multi-billion-dollar tech startup, right?
Okay, a darling of Silicon Valley.
Exactly. Claiming they have revolutionized blood testing with a single drop of blood. It's a massive, hyped-up system. Everyone is invested. The seekers are pouring billions into the sod.
A perfect modern example of compounding impotence. The tech doesn't actually work, but the belief sustains the valuation.
Exactly. Now, an independent biomedical engineer, a whistleblower, gets access to the lab. They run the diagnostics, and they write a highly detailed, irrefutable report, proving that the machines are completely fraudulent.
They are just running standard tests on commercial equipment and lying about it.
Right. So the engineer takes this report to the charismatic CEO and the board of directors. A clear recitation of evidence. When that report hits the mahogany table, does the CEO debate the biochemistry with the engineer? Do they argue about the microfluidics?
No, because the chemistry is undeniable. Engaging with the data only accelerates their demise.
Exactly. Instead, they attack the engineer. The CEO's face contorts with rage. They scream. They hire corporate spies to follow the whistleblower.
They threaten them with ruinous lawsuits.
Yes. They launch a media smear campaign to destroy the engineer's professional reputation. They try to utterly erase the person presenting the report because the intellectual battle is already lost.
The substitution of violence and intimidation for reason is the absolute hallmark of a failing system.
It's so transparent once you know what to look for.
And the source material highlights that this reaction is as old as civilization itself. When the empirical system of equity was first presented to the ancient tribal elites, they didn't ask for a debate. They literally pounced on the messengers.
But physical assault is crude.
Right.
And it often creates martyrs.
Right. So when the elites realized that overt violence wasn't entirely suppressing the message, they resorted to a secondary tactic. And this one is profoundly relevant to our modern digital age.
Oh, the tactic of noise.
Yes.
The tactic of noise.
This part of the source material fascinated me. It's the civilizational equivalent of a DOS attack.
Let's unpack the mechanics of that.
Okay, so in computer networking, a denial-of-service attack is when a malicious actor floods a targeted server or network with so much fake, superfluous traffic that the system becomes entirely overwhelmed.
The bandwidth is choked with garbage data.
Exactly, which means legitimate users cannot access the actual service. You drown out the true signal with deafening noise. The source notes that the ruling elite used this exact strategy.
They understood a terrifying mathematical reality. The exploited class always outnumbers the exploitative class. Yeah.
If the 90% who are suffering ever actually hear the clear signal of equity, if they hear the empirical proof that the vault is empty and the elite have no real power, they will stop feeding their labor into the machine.
The illusion will just shatter.
So how did the elite prevent the signal from being processed?
By deliberately flooding the channel. The source quotes the historical command given by the elite to their followers. Do not listen to this Quran and make noise in the midst of its recitation so that you may overcome.
They literally instructed the masses to whistle, to clap, to shout.
To create absolute pandemonium in the public squares whenever the message of equity and justice was being spoken, they weaponized distraction.
And if we transpose that tactic into the 21st century, the clapping and whistling have just been replaced by algorithms.
Oh, man. So true.
How does a modern exploitative system protect itself from empirical scrutiny? It generates a 247 cycle of manufactured crises.
It floods the digital ecosystem with outrage bait.
Celebrity spectacles, hyper-partisan debates over trivialities, mindless entertainment.
It's the exact same mechanic. If I can keep you constantly terrified of your neighbor, constantly enraged by a political soundbite, or constantly scrambling in a gig economy just to pay for basic groceries,
you will never have the quiet, sustained clarity required to step back and realize the system cannot even create a fly.
Wow. The noise is not an accident of the modern world. It is a structural necessity for the survival of false power.
Totalitarian regimes and highly extractive economies are always incredibly loud. They need the sensory overload to mask the baseline reality of their own impotence.
Which brings us to the ultimate root cause of all this dysfunction.
Right.
If a society is run by leaders whose faces contort with violent rage at the presentation of data,
Who rely on algorithmic noise to drown out reason.
and who demand unwavering worship while producing absolutely no intrinsic equity, what is the foundational error in that civilization's source code?
The text diagnoses it in Ayat 22.74, and it frames it as a catastrophic failure of assessment. It reads, "They did not appraise God with his true appraisal." The Arabic phrase used is ma qadarullaha haqqa qadrihi.
True appraisal.
Notice the terminology there. It is heavily rooted in valuation and measurement. Historically, theologians have interpreted this verse as a complaint about a lack of piety.
Like people aren't praying with enough sincerity or performing rituals with enough devotion.
Right. But if we maintain our rigid systems engineering framework, this verse is revealing something vastly more profound. It is identifying a lethal category error in civilizational valuation.
The society has fundamentally corrupted its core metrics for success.
Precisely. A category error, meaning they are using the wrong scale entirely to weigh reality.
They are assigning absolute, unquestionable sovereignty to entities that fail the fly test.
To corrupt politicians, to extractive wealth accumulation, to volatile algorithms, or to literal idols of stone. They appraise these impotent structures as having ultimate value.
And simultaneously, they entirely withhold recognition from the actual immutable organizing principles of reality.
The universal laws of cause and effect, of equity, of biological and physical truth, which the text defines as the laws of God, they have completely inverted the value of everything.
Let's use a macroeconomic analogy to show how deadly a false appraisal is. Because people hear appraisals and they might just think of real estate. Let's look at the 2008 financial crisis.
Perfect example.
You had a massive system of subprime mortgages. These were terrible loans given to people who could not pay them back. They were objectively toxic assets.
Right.
But the credit rating agencies, the authorities responsible for valuation, appraised those toxic assets as AAA, the safest possible investment. They stamped a false appraisal on garbage.
And the entire global banking sector built its architecture on that false appraisal.
Exactly. They traded them, leveraged them, built derivatives on top of them. But here is the critical point. The market didn't crash because an angry financial deity threw a lightning bolt at Wall Street.
No, the market crashed because you cannot indefinitely suspend the laws of mathematics.
Yes. If you build a system on a false appraisal of value, the system eventually encounters the friction of reality and it tears itself apart. The requital of a false appraisal is inevitable collapse.
It's not magic. It's a structural guarantee.
Right.
And that is the exact dynamic the text calls the law of requital. Civilizations crash when they misvalue where true power lies. The source material spends a considerable amount of time unpacking a specific historical manifestation of this false appraisal.
Which one?
The concept of human rulers claiming to be the shadow of God on earth.
Ah, the divine right of kings.
Vested interests have used this tactic for millennia. The political elite will partner with the theocratic elite to convince the masses that the king or the emperor or the dictator is the direct representative of the divine.
Therefore, the argument goes, the ruler is not bound by any empirical constraints, any constitutional laws, or any universal principles of equity.
The ruler can operate purely on arbitrary whim, and to question that whim is to question God.
It is the ultimate hack of the valuation system. The source specifically critiques the old Western legal doctrine, right? The king can commit no mistake.
Think about the immense systemic danger of that doctrine. By elevating human whim to the level of ultimate, unquestionable authority, a society mathematically guarantees its own ruin.
Because if a leader can do no wrong, there is no mechanism for course correction.
There is no wind tunnel to test the airplane wing. There is no independent auditor checking the bridge.
The engineers can build the suspension bridge out of paper mache, and if the king says it is strong, the entire society is forced to drive their trucks over it until it inevitably plunges into the river.
True power, the text insists, is not arbitrary tyranny. True power is bound by immutable law, cause and effect, and universal reason.
It's like a civilization trying to navigate a treacherous ocean, using a map they drew themselves, based entirely on their own egos, political desires, and tribal biases.
They completely ignore the actual geography of the terrain, the hidden reefs, the movement of the stars.
And when they inevitably drive their ship full speed into a jagged reef, they look around in shock. They blame bad luck. They blame enemy nations. They say the stars punished them.
But it's none of those things. It's the unavoidable mechanical requital of navigating by a false appraisal. You valued your ego over the empirical, physical reality of the reef.
And the reef always wins.
Always. And this brings us to the cascading tragedy of the situation. When you build the foundation of a society on a false appraisal, everything downstream from that error becomes deeply corrupted.
The legal system becomes unjust because it is designed to protect the whim of the elite rather than enforce universal equity.
The economy becomes extractive because it values the infinite accumulation of the sought over the basic survival of the seeker.
The culture becomes toxic because it celebrates algorithmic noise and violently suppresses whistleblowers.
The entire machinery of civilization becomes geared toward one singular, exhausting goal: maintaining the illusion of the empty vault.
It's exhausting, just analyzing it, honestly. So how do we fix the map? How does a society reprogram its navigation system before it hits the reef?
Well, it seems we have to return to the empirical test established at the very beginning of the deep dive, the fly test.
Right.
This is where we synthesize the entire diagnostic framework. The parable of the fly is not just a critique, it is a methodology.
It demands a rigorous, unflinching audit of our world. We must judge all claimed authority exclusively by its demonstrable output.
We cannot judge it by the reverence it demands, the historical inheritance it claims, or the flashy, intimidating displays it puts on.
The metric is output, deliverables. Does this system produce equity? Does it produce justice? Can it sustain life?
A society that reveres impotent symbols, whether those are corrupt politicians, obsolete economic models, or literal idols of stone, while simultaneously and aggressively resenting the people who present empirical evidence to the contrary.
That society has inverted its own measure of power.
And the ultimate civilizational lesson is stark. An order built on that inversion produces absolutely nothing.
It cannot generate justice, it cannot secure its own teacup, and it certainly cannot create a fly.
And it will continue to produce nothing, no matter how fiercely, loudly, or violently it defends itself.
Now, before we close, the source material raises a really fascinating behavioral point about how vested interests react when the pressure really gets turned up.
Oh, the compromise.
Yes. When the noise isn't working anymore, and the smear campaigns aren't working, and the population starts waking up to the empty vault, the elite pivot, they try to negotiate, they offer a compromise.
The attempt to build a hybrid system.
Exactly. The ruling class will sit across the table from the reformers and say, okay, we see your empirical evidence, the bridge is a little shaky, the inequality is getting out of hand.
So how about we mix a little bit of your truth with our failing system to keep it afloat?
Right. We'll adopt some of your language of equity in our marketing. Maybe we'll make some cosmetic changes to the tax code. We'll allow you to practice your religion a bit more openly in the public square. But in exchange, we keep control of the central vault.
They try to create a hybrid model that pacifies the masses but ultimately still serves the elite.
And the text vehemently, absolutely rejects this, doesn't it?
It completely rejects it. A system of universal equity cannot be compromised with a system of exploitation. You cannot mix a glass of pure, clean water with a vial of toxic poison and expect a healthy drink.
You just get poison water.
The source uses historical examples to show that whenever the true messengers of equity were offered a seat at the table of the corrupt elite, whenever they were offered wealth or political positions or partial power, they outright refused.
Because accepting the compromise would mean accepting the false appraisal.
It would mean validating the illusion that the elite have legitimate authority to dispense power in the first place. True systemic power demands complete alignment with universal laws. It does not negotiate with parasites.
A society running on false appraisals is like a dying legacy corporation. Think about a massive century-old company that used to innovate but has been entirely taken over by corrupt, self-serving management.
Okay.
Instead of building better products, it spends all its remaining capital on glossy marketing campaigns about its glorious history. It fires its R&D department to save money.
Right.
It punishes, demotes, or fires any mid-level manager who points out the declining revenue or the structural flaws in the supply chain. It creates an internal culture of toxic positivity and deafening noise.
The reverence for the CEO is mandated to be incredibly high. Employees are expected to applaud at every all-hands meeting.
But the actual output, the innovation, is zero. It is a zombie corporation. It's surviving purely on historical momentum and aggressive marketing, just waiting for the inevitable bankruptcy.
It is the perfect modern translation of the Daif dynamic we discussed earlier. The seeker, the employee, and the sought, the corporation, are both weak.
And the ultimate tragedy is that the employees will often fight tooth and nail to defend the CEO against outside critics, because acknowledging the bankruptcy of the company means acknowledging that they have wasted the best years of their careers.
The psychological sunk cost traps them in the burning building. So they keep making noise, they keep attending the mandated pep rallies, and they keep attacking the whistleblowers right up until the doors are padlocked.
Wow. Let's step back and look at the massive ground we've covered today. We took Surah Al-Hajj, Ayat 72-74, and we ran it through the wind tunnel.
You really did.
And what a massive paradigm shift it is to read this ancient text through the lens of sociology and systems engineering. These verses are not asking for sentimental devotion.
They are not asking you to light a candle, close your eyes, and blindly submit to the unknown.
They are demanding the exact opposite. They were demanding a rigorous, empirical, and unflinching audit of the authorities we submit to in the harsh light of day.
They demand that we stop measuring power by the size of the shadow it casts and start measuring it by the biological and societal life it actually sustains.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you, the listener, with a specific lingering thought. I want you to take the fly test out of the abstract and into your own life.
Apply.
Look at the structures you interact with. Look at the financial institutions, the algorithmic social media platforms, the political parties, the corporate hierarchies.
Or even the personal ideologies we grant the most power to today.
Exactly. These are the entities we allow to dictate our stress levels, extract our labor, and frame our understanding of reality. Subject them to the audit. Ask yourself, how many of them are actually just impotent structures, producing nothing of true intrinsic value?
Surviving purely on our misplaced reverence and their ability to generate deafening, endless noise.
You have to ask yourself, are you pouring your life's labor into an empty vault?
That's the real question.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the metrics, keep asking for the deliverables, and most importantly, never let the noise drown out the signal. We'll see you next time.